understand why it is a discipline. But it is necessary for our spiritual health. Everything we've talked about so far, prayer, fasting, Bible study, we think of those as spiritual things. We class those in the spiritual category. But for spiritual health, it can't be isolated. It's going to affect the practical. It will affect how we live our lives. And giving is one indicator of spiritual health. If someone is not tithing, if someone is not giving, then it's an indicator that something is missing in their spiritual walk. It may be knowledge, it may be submission, but something is missing. Because they're missing out on a lot of benefits, and we're going to talk about this tonight. So I have a lot of notes, just to warn you. But I have no emotional stories. I have no, faith-building testimonies. Those are great, but that's not our purpose here tonight. I have Bible passage, and I have just talking about why we do it. All right, so we're getting into the Word, and just to have that understanding. I'm not trying to convince anybody new necessarily or anything like that, but those of you that already practice this, I'm reminding you. We all need that reminder, and just a reminder of the privilege that we have to give. So the first verse we will look at is Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 to 12, and I am going to read this. It says, "Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. And prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, saith the Lord of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for ye shall be a delightsome land, saith the Lord of hosts." So we will look at some other verses as well. I'm not even going to spend much time on this one because we are going to go that quick. But this is a very good foundation. This is the one that always gets pulled out. It's like the first one we think about when we talk about tithes and offering. And so we learn two things very, very quickly. Not bringing our tithes and our offerings is robbing God. And bringing our tithes, the other side of it, the opposite of it, bringing our tithes and our offerings brings a blessing. It brings a blessing to ourselves. So, tithing in the Bible. All right, let's start basic. I know this isn't new to anyone, but let's start basic. What is a tithe? What is tithing? Somebody, go. Pardon?
When the water rise.
Oh dear. Pardon? Yes. It is the first 10% of all income, however you want to say that. The first 10% of all increase. The first mention of tithing in the Bible is with Abraham. Abraham went to war against 4 kings and the nations that they ruled. With 318 people, by the way. The Bible specifies. He went to war against 4 nations with 318 people. Just let that sink in for a little bit. That's a small army to rescue his nephew Lot. But yet he came back not only victorious, but with the goods and the spoils of that victory. Genesis 14. Again, you have all the scriptures, so I may not read them all. I have them written out. I think that's why I've got a lot of notes, because I've got them written out. But Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. We don't actually get a whole lot of detail here about this meeting, but it happened as Abraham was on his way back with the spoils of victory, and he blessed him. Melchizedek blessed Abraham and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand." And he gave him tithes of all. Now, again, we're not going to get into the typology of Melchizedek and how he was a type of Jesus Christ and Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek the priest. Keeping it simple. His grandson, Jacob, also refers to tithing. The Lord appeared to him at Bethel. It's where he had the dream of the angels descending and ascending on the ladder. And he gave him the same promise that God had given to Abraham, his father. He's going to make of him a great nation. He's going to bless him. All this land will be yours, etc. and etc. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat, raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God, and this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. That was Jacob's commitment, his promise to God. If you'll be with me, you'll be my God. This will be God's house, and I'll give you a 10th of everything. Now, at this point, these two examples, there has been no command to tithe, at least recorded in Scripture. There's nowhere where God commanded this, demanded this, instructed this, that we know of. But we see as their relationship with God developed, we see them willingly doing this. It was after a victory, it was after an encounter with God that both of them made this decision. And of course, there may be other examples that we don't know about because it's not recorded, but those are the two we know. Now, when the law was given through Moses, tithing was included as a part of the law. You can look at it in Leviticus. All the tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord. So in other words, that first 10th, because tithe literally just means 10th. That's how we know it's 10%. That's the direct translation of it. All of it, that tithe, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereto the 5th part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord. So it was commanded to them of whether it was fruit of the tree, whether it was their flocks, no matter what it was, because that was basically their money. That was how they lived. Whatever it was that they possessed, 1/10 of that belonged to the Lord. It was holy to the Lord. And just to explain a couple of things here, if he will at all redeem aught of his tithes. In other words, if he had 10 cows, and so one of those cows belonged to God, then he could either give the cow to the temple, or he could pay the value of the cow. That's what it means to redeem it. So he would keep the cow, but he would pay the value of the cow. If he did that, he was actually tithing 12%, because he was apt to add 20%. I don't know the reason for that. I have a feeling it's so that they didn't accidentally rip off, if they misestimated the value or something. That's my theory, but I don't know. And so but either way, whether it was the value of the cow or the cow itself, 10% was being given to the Lord. Whatsoever passes under the rod. So they would have the rod as they were counting them, as they were, whatever the occasion was, going from the field to whatever, as they were counting the flock. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. All right, that one's God's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. That one's God's. So they were to set aside the 10th or the tithe for the Lord. So that was Israel's commandment. Now we know that Israel was not always obedient to the commandments. In not just this area, but every area pretty much where they were commanded, we find that Israel at one point or another failed very much. Israel and Judah, once they were divided. And they ended up in exile because of this. Israel to the Assyrians, Judah to the Babylonians. Now on Judah's return to Jerusalem, they renewed their covenant with God. In Nehemiah 10, we find this as they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. The leaders got together and they made a covenant. They renewed the covenant with God. And they said they would bring the first fruits of their ground, the first fruits of all fruit of all trees, year by year, unto the house of the Lord. Also the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law. And the firstlings of our herds and our flocks to bring to the house of God, unto the priests that minister in the house of our God. and that we should bring the first fruits of our dough and our offerings, and the fruit of all manner of trees, of wine and of oil. So there's a long list, all right? Unto the priests, to the chambers of the house of our God, and the tithes of our ground unto the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithe in all the cities of our tillage. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes, and the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes, a tenth of a tenth, so that would be 1%, unto the house of our God, to the chambers, into the treasure house. For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the corn, of the new wine, and the oil unto the chambers, etc., etc. And we will not forsake the house of our God. So we see them renewing the covenant. And part of what they realized that they had let down on was this commandment to tithe. By the way, tithing, like I said, it literally means 10%. But if you were to do the research and look into all of the different tithings and offerings and things that they were meant to bring, it actually ends up being more like 20% if you add it all together. Just throwing that out there for your information. In this verse in Nehemiah, we notice that the priests and the Levites were not exempt from tithing. So the tithe was brought to the Levites and the priests for them to live off of, for them to support themselves and their families, and to take care of the sanctuary. And then they also, and there's other verses that talk about this, but then they would also tithe. And you read some places, it's kind of like, okay, the Levites would tithe to the priests would tithe to the high priest. You can read about the hierarchy of how that goes. But every single one of them was to tithe. So it wasn't just everybody supporting the ministry. This was something that every single Israelite person was to do. They also lived on the 90%. All right, that's Old Testament. Let's go to the New Testament. In the New Testament, there is no direct command to tithe. But we see it is an established practice. I think we said the same thing last week with fasting. It may not say, pay your tithes, but we see that there's an established practice. Luke 11:42, this is Jesus speaking. He said, "Woe unto you, Pharisees, for ye tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass over judgment and the love of God. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone." So this verse has been taken out of context so many times and twisted to say, well, you don't have to pay tithes. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for doing it. No, he didn't. He said, you're being so careful in this area of the law. Your tithing is so precise and exact that if you grow a mint in your garden, you've seen mint, it's just it's not a huge plant, right? It's an herb. If you're growing mint in the garden, you make sure to cut one out of every 10 leaves and bring it to the priest, They were that careful, but yet they weren't looking after things like justice and love. They were missing in some of those big areas. But his command to them was to do these things, the judgment, the justice, the love of God, and not to leave the other undone. So keep on tithing on your mint and your rue. I don't know what rue is, but it's an herb. And all manner of herbs. Keep doing that. But don't forget about love. Don't forget about. And so it's not an either-or scenario. He's saying, have them both. Do both. There's also a reference to tithing in Hebrews. We'll skip over that one. Okay, so what is the difference between tithing in the Old and the New Testaments? One of the big differences between the two was the Roman occupation. There had been a shift between the two. They were no longer a nation of their own, but they were under oppression by the Romans. And their culture had kind of changed. There was less emphasis on farming and more emphasis on trade. So money had become a much more prominent, part of culture. And so it is a more similar society to how we would operate now. So the principle still works. We might not have cows and produce, but you understand it's the same. It carries across. We just do it with money now because that's what we earn. We don't get paid in cows. Anyway.
For yourself.
Sorry. I don't get get paid in cows. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul, and some other places, but this one we'll read. Paul emphasized the responsibility to support the ministry. Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. You brought a sacrifice, an offering to the priest, depending on the type of offering. There's a whole bunch of different types, which is a lesson for another time. But depending on which type it was, often the priest would get to take part of that, and that would be their meal. All right? And sometimes the bringer of the offering would get to eat it too, and it was a communion, a fellowship offering. Anyway. Lost my place. Even so, hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. You go to work, you get paid, so does a minister. That brings us to the next section. Why tithe? All right? Reason number 1, tithing is biblical. I'm not going to add any more to that. That's what I've just covered. All right? Tithing is biblical. A second reason is because tithing supports, and we've just touched on this, tithing supports the work of the Lord. The Old Testament, the tithe went to the Levites, it went to the priests, it went to the ministry. The New Testament early church, we have a little less record, but it's pretty clear when you look at it that it also went to the ministry. Although if they were Jewish Christians, I'm wondering if they will double tithing. Did they tithe to the Levites and to the ministry? I don't know. Somebody want to research that and let me know how they handled that? When did they decide to switch it? Anyway, somebody find that out and let me know. Do some digging. Gentile Christians would have been a little easier. They just don't have to worry about getting to the temple. But anyway. So it went to the ministry. That doesn't mean that the Levites or the ministry, that they kept it all and just got richer and richer and richer. Although they technically would have the right to do so. But they were to live off of it. And then they would also manage the storehouse and the temple treasuries. So I know sometimes we see abuses. I don't think we have to look very far. You can look on the internet, you can look on TV, you can see abuses where people have taken and they've, more than the tithe, where they've, anyway, done things for money and they seem to grow richer and richer and it turns people off from that. But, lost my train of thought. That was a side. You ever have that where you're in mid-thought and you just go blank? Goodness me. All right, but there would be temple projects, giving to particular needs, etc. So they would manage what was given them. But it was their right to live off of it. 1 Corinthians 9, it said, don't muzzle the ox which treads the grain. In other words, you're working in the field, you get to eat of the field kind of thing. Now, all of this, we're talking about, what the Bible says and practice. Now, I'll just be honest, I think most of you know this. We don't quite operate like this at Church of Hope. I don't take a paycheck, so I technically do not take any of the tithes that are paid into Church of Hope. But I will say this has its advantages. The bank account gets more money. The church can support itself, pay for the lights, all that. Those are some of the advantages. It has its disadvantages as well. Because as you know, my husband works to support us. We have some partners in missions that support us. But that also means that I have other commitments that are necessary for us to support ourselves. That I'm not technically a full-time pastor. Because I'm involved in those other things. So just be aware of that. That's our current situation. There is some advantages and some disadvantages. It's like, Paul didn't take tithes with the churches he ministered to at either. He didn't take funds from them. He worked to support himself. But he acknowledged some advantages of that, and he did it for the benefit of the people, but there was also some disadvantages, and they didn't learn sometimes the benefit of giving. Now, I'm thankful for Church of Hope. Everybody's great. And I like seeing the bank account, not because I profit from it at all. I like to see it because I'm like, yep, that's our building money. So I like to see it grow for that reason. But and just to see how God is blessing people and how that's reflected in the giving. Tithing, this is reason number 3. Tithing is good stewardship. Tithing is good stewardship. Stewardship is all about managing somebody else's property. That's what a steward does. Not an airline stewardess. It's managing somebody else's property. And so we find this principle all throughout the Bible. Look in almost every book of the Bible, you'll find something that has to do with stewardship. Because everything that we have, everything that we manage, that we take care of, is not really our own. Right. Our families, there are families, but we're also being entrusted with caring and loving for them by the one who gave them to us. Our money, we understand that God is the one that gives us the ability to earn it. There's the parable of the talents. It's, what will you do with what God gives you? There's the verse that talks about redeeming the time. It's the stewardship of our time. Preaching the gospel. We've been entrusted with the gospel. How will we manage that? What will we do with it? Stewardship is all through there. We are entrusted with God's many gifts, and we're given guidance for how to use them. And then that's where God kind of steps back a little bit. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do? Are you going to follow the guidance that I've given you? Are you going to manage what I've given you in the way that I've given you to manage it? And you have a choice. And this includes our use of money. Now, we don't typically like talking about money at church a lot. We realize that 16 out of the 38 parables in the Gospels are related to money or possessions. The Bible has around 500 verses on prayer. I did not count them personally. I did get this information off the internet. The Bible has 500 verses on prayer, just a bit less than that on faith, but more than 2,000 on money and possessions. More than 2,000. You want to learn how to manage your money? I've got a textbook for you. There are Bible principles for managing your money that a lot of people are unaware of, and if you will live by them, you will prosper. Now, this is not prosperity gospel. This is just saying that there are time-tested principles that are given by God that will work. There are principles on debt. The borrower is slave to the lender. Avoid debt at all costs. Avoid co-signing. There's information about co-signing or guaranteeing, I guess we would call it here, being a guarantor. That's in the Bible. And it advises against it, by the way. Saving, storing up for the future, business principles, all of those are in the Bible. There's a lot of the Proverbs is great for that kind of stuff. If you will dig in, you will find out how to manage money from the Word of God. But the first part of that, one of the first principles of stewardship, is tithing. The principles of first fruits, on to page 2 of your handout. The principles of first fruits. All right, this is simply the principle that every first thing belongs to God and is consecrated to Him. Every first thing is holy unto God. The firstborn son was special in every family and received double the inheritance of the other sons usually. Why? Was that particular son any better than the rest of them? Probably not. But it represented the whole. It represented all that was to come. It represented the lineage being passed on. After Passover, we see that God laid claim on every firstborn, because the firstborns were supposed to be killed, but if the blood was applied, He passed over them. So now He said, they're mine. The firstborn sons are mine. Now they would redeem them. They didn't offer them up as human sacrifices or something. They would redeem them with money. And that privilege was to serve and to be consecrated. God was passed on to the Levites instead. So they were serving instead of the firstborn sons. They were to bring the first of their flocks and of their crops to God. First. Not the last, not the leftovers, but the first. Now when Israel began to take the promised land, now this is really cool, okay? When Israel was to take the promised land, then what was the first city that they came to? The first city that they had victory in. The first city, I was going to say that they attacked, but I can't really use that language. The first city that they conquered? Anybody?
Jericho.
Jericho. All right, now you know why I can't say they attacked it, because they just wiped it on the walls. But it was the first city that God gave to them. And they were commanded to take no spoil from Jericho. Every other city after that, it was fine, because that was how it was. You go, you conquer somebody, you get to take their spoil. You get to take their gold and their silver and all that. You've earned it, you've conquered them. That was just how it was. But Jericho, they were not to take any gold, any silver, nothing. All was accursed. Everything was to be burnt by fire, except Joshua 6:19. All the silver, the gold, the vessels of brass and iron are consecrated unto the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. What was special about Jericho? It was the first city. It belonged to God. Its spoil belonged to God. And the story of Achan, A-C-H-A-N, the story of Achan will show you the importance of tithing. Because when they go on to the next city, you may know the story, Ai, Israel was defeated, and very badly. Because one man in the camp had sinned. What was his sin? He had taken part of the spoil from Jericho. Joshua 7, indeed I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this I have done. I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonish garment, and 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold of 50 shekels of weight. And I coveted them, and took them, and behold, they are hid in the earth in the midst of my tent, and the silver under it. He was disobedient to the commandment, and he took what belonged to God. That was Achan's sin. They were stoned, both Achan and his family, and it seems harsh, but only then did God grant victory to Israel. Because if they were not willing to give him what was first, then how could he trust them with the rest? This is what tithing is all about. It might seem kind of harsh. Well, he got the spoil, but he had stolen it directly from God. Your tithe, your first 10%, is blessed when it is given to the Lord, but it is cursed if it stays in your tent. Romans 11:16, first part of that verse says, if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. The rest of it is also holy. If you will give your first 10% to God, if you will make it holy by consecrating it to the Lord, then it sanctifies the rest of what you own. But if you withhold that, then the curse comes upon all the rest. If you will honor God with the first fruits, then he will remove the curse from the whole, and it will be holy and blessed. Tithing is, like I said, there's principles for all kinds of financial stuff in the Bible, but tithing is that number one key. There are, I don't know, I haven't looked into it in this country, but I know back in Canada there would be a lot of businessmen that would tithe that didn't even have hardly any kind of faith, but they just understood that, there's some tax deductions as well, but always an incentive. But they understood this principle. There would be those that would donate and give because they understood that they may not go to church at all, they may not practice, but they understood that they would put God first, that God would bless them. Okay, fourth reason, I've got to hurry. Fourth reason, tithing tests your heart. Or tithing tests my heart. Let's personalize that. A lot of people are fine when a pastor tries to teach spiritual principles. Sure, tell me about prayer. Sure, tell me about fasting. Tell me about love and kindness and goodness and all the rest of it. But don't touch my stuff. Until Christianity touches your practical life, your everyday life, it's just theory. And this is one area where theology and practicality, they meet. And tithing acknowledges that all that we have is God's. And it expresses gratefulness for the 90% that God so graciously allows us to keep. Often those that don't want to pay tithes are, why would I give God 10%? God gave you 90. God is allowing you to keep 90%. That's the way that you should look at it, because that 10% already belongs to him. But Matthew 6:21, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. This is a true saying, and I don't know if it's a quote or if I made it up, I'm not sure. But people invest in what they value. People people invest in what they value. And people value what they invest in. You can tell what people's priorities are by where their time and money are being spent. But when you have time and money invested into something, it begins to take priority in your life. This is one thing that Church of Hope is really good at, I think. It shows your priority when you're faithful to the house of God, in your attendance, in your giving, your love for one another. It shows your priority. It shows where your heart is. Luke chapter 16 and 11. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, King James Version says mammon, who will entrust to you the true riches? When you put God first in finance, it shows him that he can trust you with blessings even beyond finance. Fifth point, tithing brings blessings. It's not why we do it. At least it shouldn't be. It's not why we do it, but it's a result of it. It will bring blessing upon your life. Yeah. It may not always be financial blessing, although I believe you will always have enough. God will always provide if you will put him first. Amen. It doesn't mean you'll be a millionaire or billionaire, but God will bless you. Sorry. God will bless you. You'll be a millionaire and a billionaire in heaven if that matters. You'll have all of it will be yours. But God does not need your money. No. This is not about God being like, give me, I want to get rich. God does not need your money. He owns a cattle on 1,000 hills, all right? And he could support his church and his work any way that he chose to do. Elijah, during a famine, got fed by ravens. So if God had ordained it, the ministry would get fed by ravens, all right? But that's not what God chose to do. He chose a way in which we can participate and be blessed, in which we have a direct share. When God asked, will a man rob God? And the answer is yes, they were robbing God in tithes and offerings, but they were actually robbing themselves as well of the blessings, because he said, try me, prove me. If you will do this, if you will put me first, if you will give to me what is mine, then try me. I'm going to open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that your storehouses are not able to fill, or not able to, take. It is a privilege to give to the Lord, not only to be a part of the work of the Lord and to share in that, but also because of the blessings that come with it. Amen. When you put God first. Okay, I promise, I am hurrying. But the next section here, answering popular excuses. Now, you may have heard some of these. I don't know if in the past any of you have ever said any of them. I have no idea, so this is good. But I couldn't find any UK statistics, which disappointed me. I found some US statistics that say only 10 to 25% of churchgoers tithe. I don't know what it would be in the UK. I tend to think it might be lower, but I don't know. I would assume so. We have less of a Bible-built culture here and more, yeah. Anyway, why do you think that is? Pardon?
Not real church, I guess.
Okay. Maybe a lack of teaching. If people are not told that's in the Bible and they've not discovered that may be a reason. Any other thoughts?
They don't see why they should, because they think that all the money's theirs.
Yeah.
They don't see it as God's.
It's true. It requires a mindset shift. And like I think I've talked before, I grew up being taught tithing, basically. I don't remember it, but I just know it was kind of bit by bit, normal. Somebody comes in for the first time, and I've heard even some from this church share that experience, the first 10%, I'm sorry, 10%, because it requires a mindset shift about the way that you think about your stuff, your money, what you've earned, and you relinquish. It's a surrender thing. Because you've got to surrender and realize, actually, it's all God's, and he's given me an ability. These are some of the excuses, and I have arguments, but it's really excuses that people come up with, sometimes misunderstandings. First one, and we'll answer them and explain them. First one, very quickly. Tithing is an Old Testament law. I don't have to tithe. That was an Old Testament law. That was in Moses' law. Jesus did away with that. He fulfilled that. I don't have to obey that. Any responses? Anybody know? What would you say to that?
No.
Thank you. Perfect. All right. Well, couple points here. As we saw, it was also practiced in the New Testament. Jesus did refer to it. There are verses talking about it. But we don't throw out Old Testament law just because it's in the Old Testament. That's the first thing. I don't say, well, I can go and commit adultery because that was Old Testament law. I can go and steal because that was Old Testament law. Or whatever, whatever case it may be. The law was not done away with as in destroyed. Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill it. We may not keep all of the ceremonial and civil parts of the law. The moral law still very much is in effect. But even in that civil and ceremonial law, the principles of it still apply. I mean, there was things in the law like don't mix wool and linen. Am I mixing wool and linen? Actually, I think a few of you might be doing that. I think a few of you might be doing that tonight. That was a principle in Old Testament law, and there was different things. Don't sow this with this. Don't have this one this animal plowing with this animal. Things like that. We may not keep those, and there was reasons behind those things, but we may not keep all of those strict things because Jesus fulfilled the law. But the principle of the law is still carried out in that we learn about separation. It's very important to God. And I'm just throwing that out as one example. There was laws about how they treated people. I mean, we don't throw those out and treat people like dirt because we can because Christians. Love actually calls us to a higher standard, to a higher law. It's not that the law is done away with. It's no longer that we need the letter of the law because we walk in the spirit of the law, which, again, often calls us to a higher standard. But those same principles will apply. But this is the other thing. Abraham and Jacob were before the law was given. Abraham, I think it's Hebrews. Is it Hebrews or is it Galatians? One of them that talks about how, our faith, it doesn't go back to the law. It goes back to Abraham. Abraham is the father of the faithful. We are the seed of Abraham through our relationship with Jesus Christ. Abraham and Jacob tithed before the law was ever given. The law just instituted it, established it but it existed before that. Okay, I need to hurry. Excuse number 2. I tithe to charity. Has anyone ever heard that? I don't have to tithe because I give to the poor. I give to this charity. That's my tithe. I give in those areas. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that before.
I give to HMRC.
Yeah, HMRC. I did consider putting I pay taxes as one of the reasons why, but I didn't know if that was one. Anyway. The tithe, this will answer that one as well. The tithe was for the house of the Lord. It wasn't for HMRC. It wasn't for the poor. It wasn't for any of those things. Not that the HMRC is poor. But there were offerings on top of the tithes. There were separate laws governing provision for the poor. One of those examples was they weren't to harvest the corner of their fields, so that those that didn't have enough could go out and work in their fields and be able to collect what was left over. Now, of course, we've got provision for the poor through our taxes, honestly. Through programs, we may support charities, that's fine. There's still a personal role to play. The New Testament especially, we are to help those that are in need, but it is not the tithe, all right? That's extra. That kind of comes in as offerings, all right, which is a whole other thing. Someone once used the illustration of eating at a restaurant. And if you go out to Nando's, I like Nando's, you go out to Nando's, where do you pay the bill? Who do you send the money to?
Nando's.
Thank you. You go up to the till. Well, I guess at Nando's is maybe a bad example because you pay before you eat it there. But you don't?
No, we do. I just
Oh.
don't like paying for the food.
Oh, you don't? Okay. I was like, all right. But you don't send it to the McDonald's.
No.
You don't even send it to the Nando's down in London if you're eating up here in Edinburgh. You don't send the money to the food bank, although it's great, send money to the food bank, but there's a bill at Nando's, right? You pay where you get fed. It's the same with tithes. You support your local church, all right? Maybe that's a bad example, I don't know if that would. Number three, third excuse. I don't trust the church. Now this is maybe one that was being alluded to earlier. I don't trust the church. Where's the money going to? What are they using it for? Who's going to buy a new car with this? You know. Now, I believe in full transparency. You can come to our business meetings, show you what money's been spent on here at Church of Hope, all right? You can ask me anytime, and we'll let you know what's being spent on what. If you really want to know, I can break it down. Pretty precise. You have the right to ask questions. Not just saying you, but anybody attending any church. They have the right to ask questions about where the money is going. You have the right to change churches if a church or minister is misusing funds. You have the right to do that. Biblically, what you don't have the right to is to withhold your tithe. Right? If you can't, in good conscience, pay it here, pay it there. You know, well, then I'm saying pay where you get fed. So then, anyway. But you don't have the right to withhold tithes. When asked about taxes, Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's.
Right.
Try withholding your taxes and see what happens.
Yeah, thank you.
God is so much more gracious than the tax people will ever be. All right? You have a say over what your tax money goes to through your voting. Through, you can write your MP. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be, you don't have control over where it goes, but you have a say. And that is basically the same thing with tithes. You have a say in the local church, but you don't get to control where it goes. And I don't mean that in like a dictatorial way. And hopefully you get where I'm coming with that. That excuse, don't trust the church, is just not going to hold up. Okay, fourth one, I can't afford to. I can't afford to. And this is probably one of the biggest reasons why people say that they don't pay tithes. I can't afford to. But the reality is, you can't afford not to. Malachi 3:11 says, I will rebuke the devourer for your sake, and he will not destroy the fruits of your ground. That's if you tithe, God will rebuke the devourer. The flip side of that is if you do not, but if you rob God, the devourer has access. The fruit of your grounds might be destroyed. What you earn is not blessed. It's not multiplied by God. It does take faith to tithe. It takes faith to give that first 10% and trust that the other 90% will be enough. And so it does come down to faith. If you pay, you're believing the Bible that God will bless it. If you do not, it is a lack of faith. Tithing is not a question of income, but of obedience. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, whether you're young or old. If you make £1, you can tithe 10 pence. If you make £1 million, you can tithe more.
The zero.
It's late. You can, no, 100,000, right? Yeah. You can tithe 100,000. That's embarrassing. But tithing is a heart issue. It's not really a money issue. It's a heart issue. And if you do not tithe on the £1 and are not willing to tithe on the £1, you're not going to tithe on the 1 million. And I know that's extreme examples, but it's just the reality. I have notes here on offerings. We do not have time for them. I don't know if it's weird. Can I stick offerings into discipleship with next week? Sure, why not?
Sure.
I knew he was going to say that.
Offering.
Yeah, let's end there. Tithing, not a heart issue, not an income issue, a heart issue. Let's end it there. This might be awkward topics together next week.